chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Part 1. Theodore Langley let out a slow breath as he leaned back in his desk chair, staring at the email that had just landed in his inbox. The subject line read, "Project Approval, Blackwood House." He had almost forgotten about the proposal. The inquiry had come through his firm's website 2 months ago, requesting a lead architect for an urgent and private restoration project. It wasn't unusual. Langley specialized in historical preservation, and his name had weight in the industry. What was unusual was the secrecy surrounding the request. No company name, no individual representing the client, just a signature at the bottom of each email. S.C. Blackwood. His cursor hovered over the attached contract. He'd sent an estimate weeks ago and had heard nothing since. Now, out of nowhere, an offer. A generous one. Too generous. Rachel's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're not actually considering this." Langley glanced up from his laptop. His fiancée stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over her sweater. She'd been reading over his shoulder, frowning the entire time. "It's an easy job," he said, downplaying it. "Basic restoration work. The house is already structurally sound." Rachel scoffed. "Then why are they offering twice your usual rate?" He smiled. "Maybe I'm just that good." Her expression didn't change. Or maybe it's a scam, or worse, some lunatic trying to lure you into an abandoned house to... She cut herself off, shaking her head. "Theo, this is shady as hell." Langley rubbed his temple. She wasn't wrong. The secrecy was strange, but high-profile clients, especially ones preserving old family estates, sometimes valued discretion over transparency. Still, Rachel had good instincts. "I'll ask around," he assured her. "David might have heard of the place." Rachel didn't look convinced. "Fine," she said, "but don't sign anything yet." She kissed the top of his head and left the room. Langley turned back to his laptop, scanning the restoration requirements. It all looked standard. Repair and documentation of existing architecture, no major alterations. One line stood out. All changes must adhere to the original design. Do not deviate from the blueprint. Langley exhaled sharply. The restriction was odd. Historical restoration allowed for adjustments. He was about to close the email when something made him pause. At the bottom of the contract, his name was already signed. Theodore Langley. The date next to it read 1 week ago. His chest tightened. He had never signed this document. Before he could process what that meant, his phone vibrated. A text from David. "Meet me at Juno's. We need to talk." Juno's cafe was nearly empty when Langley arrived. David was already at their usual corner booth, stirring a mug of coffee. "All right, I did some digging," David said as Langley slid into the seat across from him. "Blackwood House. You know it's not on any current property records?" Langley frowned. "How is that possible?" David shrugged. "That's what I was wondering. No tax filings, no ownership records for the last 50 years, just nothing." He slid his phone across the table. "Found an old listing from the 70s, though, and get this, it's never been sold. Never foreclosed, just sat there, abandoned." Langley scrolled through the black and white photo. The house was immense, its silhouette sharp against a clouded sky. Gables twisted like arthritic fingers, a widow's walk perched atop the steep roofline. "Jesus," Langley muttered, "that's a hell of a house." David leaned forward. "Look, man, I know you love this old shit, but there's something off about this place. The contracts, the money, it doesn't add up. I think someone's playing you." Langley hesitated. "The money's real." "That doesn't mean you should take it." David's phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen. "Rachel just texted me. She says she doesn't want you going." Langley sighed. Of course she did. David studied him for a moment. "You're still taking it, aren't you?" Langley looked back at the house photo, something about it pulling at him. "Yeah." Rachel was waiting for him when he got home. "You already signed it, didn't you?" Langley hesitated. "That's not an answer." He rubbed his face. "Rach, I need this job. The money." "I don't care about the money," her voice cracked. "I care about you, and this feels wrong." Langley exhaled. "I'll be careful." Rachel swallowed, looking at him like she already knew something was going to happen. "Just promise me," she said softly, "that you'll come back." Langley meant to say, "I promise." Instead, he kissed her forehead and murmured, "I'll call you when I get there." The next morning, Langley drove north, leaving Boston behind. The GPS lost signal an hour from the site, forcing him to rely on printed directions. As he neared the estate, a dense fog rolled in, swallowing the twisting back roads. His contractor, Elliot, was already waiting at the gate. A no-nonsense builder, mid-40s, arms crossed. "Place looks like something out of Lovecraft," Elliot muttered as Langley stepped out. Langley followed his gaze. Blackwood House loomed at the end of the frostbitten driveway. The house was wrong. Not in any obvious way, but the longer Langley looked at it, the more the details seemed to shift. Gables too steep, windows slightly out of place. He checked the blueprints tucked under his arm. The house didn't match. Rachel's call came through just as Langley and Elliot reached the front steps. "I'm here," he said, trying to sound normal. "Send me a picture," she insisted. "I want to see where you're staying." Langley hesitated. His gut said not to. Still, he lifted his phone. His screen glitched. The camera app refused to open. "Shit," Langley said. "What?" Rachel asked. He forced a chuckle. "Nothing. Signal's bad." He heard her exhale. "Just be careful, Theo." Elliot stepped back from the iron door, frowning. "Dude," he said, "this place ain't normal." Langley looked at the front facade again. The house was different. Subtle, but real. The right side window was closer than before. He checked the blueprints again. His heart skipped a beat. There should be 2 doors. Instead, there were 3. Part 2. Elliot took a step back from the black iron door, rubbing his arms against the cold. Nope, I don't like this." Langley rolled his shoulders, forcing his voice to stay even. "It's just an old house." Elliot shot him a look. "Then why does it feel like it's looking at us?" Langley checked the blueprints again. 2 doors. The house had 3. Maybe it was an undocumented addition. But something about the 3rd door felt wrong. It was darker than the surrounding wood, as if it had been an afterthought. A gust of wind kicked up, rattling the trees, and the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. Then, with a groan of rusted hinges, the iron door swung open on its own. Langley and Elliot froze. The doorway yawned open, revealing a darkened foyer, the interior eerily untouched by time. Langley exhaled sharply, stepping forward. "Let's just do a quick walkthrough." "Nope," Elliot interrupted, shaking his head and already backing toward the truck. "I don't mess with haunted shit. I fix walls, floors, and bad wiring, not whatever the hell this is." Langley hesitated. "Elliot, You can call me if you need an extra set of hands, but I'm not going in there. Langley considered arguing, but Elliot was already climbing into the driver's seat of his truck. With a gruff nod, he slammed the door shut, reversing down the long driveway. Langley turned back to the open entrance. The inside was waiting. His phone buzzed. Another email. From S.C. Blackwood. Subject, proceed alone. A chill ran down his spine. He glanced over his shoulder, watching Elliot's taillights fade into the mist. Then he turned back to the house and stepped inside. The foyer was larger than expected, its double-height ceiling stretching upward into dim, dust-filtered light. A grand staircase curled toward a second-floor gallery, its mahogany railing untouched by decay. The place should have been falling apart, yet it wasn't. Langley unrolled the blueprints and double-checked the layout. The entrance was supposed to lead to 2 parlors on either side, but there were 3 doorways again. He swallowed hard. His phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. Rachel, you okay? Langley stared at the screen. His signal should be dead this deep in the woods, but somehow the text came through perfectly. He typed, "Yeah, I just started the survey." Message failed to send. He tried again. Message failed to send. Langley exhaled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He moved to the left parlor, cataloging anomalies. The ceiling moldings were too intricate compared to the original design. The windows were slightly misaligned with external walls. The fireplace was too shallow, as if shrinking inward. The structure was subtly wrong. He stepped toward the middle door, the one that shouldn't exist. It was different. The wood was darker, almost charred. There was no doorknob, only a black iron plate in the center, embossed with a strange filigree design. Langley reached out. The floorboards groaned. A sharp creak sounded behind him. He whirled. The iron door, the one that had opened on its own, was now shut. His stomach twisted. Then, from the dark hallway beyond the middle door, came a sound. A whisper. Langley backed away from the door. He was tired, probably imagining things. His phone buzzed again. From S.C. Blackwood. Subject, do not deviate. Langley's jaw clenched. He turned away from the middle door, determined to ignore it. But as he stepped into the right parlor, he noticed something that made his blood go cold. The blueprints had changed. Langley spread the blueprints across a dusty desk, hands shaking slightly. The house's layout had shifted. The entrance hall was wider, the staircase angled differently, and worst of all, the middle door was now included, as if it had always been there. Langley ran a hand through his hair. He was overtired, stressed, and overthinking. The house hadn't changed. Had it? A slow creak echoed from the foyer. Langley turned sharply. The middle door was open. A dark hallway stretched beyond it, lined with unlit gas lamps. The air that drifted from it smelled of old books and polished mahogany. He stepped forward. 1 step. 2. The moment he crossed the threshold, the house changed. The air grew dense, as if the walls had sealed behind him. The foyer was gone. Only the hallway remained. Langley swallowed hard. His fingers gripped the blueprint tightly. At the end of the corridor, a wooden desk waited, and on it, resting in pristine condition, was a set of blueprints, arranged as if waiting for him to examine them. Langley stepped closer. The name at the top made his blood run cold. Blackwood House, original design, architect Theodore Langley. The date at the bottom? 1893. Part 3. Langley's fingers trembled as he traced the name at the top of the blueprint. His name, 130 years before his birth. The ink wasn't faded. It looked fresh, as though it had been printed yesterday. The paper itself was pristine, untouched by time, its edges crisp beneath his fingertips. He turned the page, skimming through the details. The dimensions were the same, and the structural reinforcements were identical to the ones he'd studied before leaving Boston. But then the differences began stacking up. There were annotations in his handwriting, noting where materials had been sourced and where reinforcements had been adjusted. A half-finished pencil sketch of the main staircase bore the same strokes he used when designing, his habits, style, and exacting precision. Langley took a step back from the desk, his throat dry. This is a prank, some elaborate, well-researched trick. But who would go to these lengths? Rachel? David? No, neither of them would do this. His phone buzzed in his pocket, making him flinch. He fished it out, the screen illuminating in the dimly lit corridor. Another email. From S.C. Blackwood. Subject, you already know. The words blurred for a moment before refocusing. You already know. A chill ran through him, deep and sharp. He turned sharply toward the way he had come, but the door was gone. Langley's stomach clenched. He was standing in the same dim hallway, but where the entrance had been, there was now only unbroken wall. The plaster, the wood paneling, it was seamless, as though a door had never existed at all. He pressed his palm against the wall, feeling for a seam, a hidden mechanism, anything that might indicate the door was still there. Nothing. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The house was old. Maybe it had hidden passages. Or maybe this was an illusion, a trick of architecture designed to disorient visitors. He turned back to the desk. The blueprints were waiting. Langley hesitated, then flipped through more pages, scanning the details. A notation caught his eye, an area labeled Architect's Quarters. His brow furrowed. That section hadn't been in the documents he'd reviewed before the trip. There had been no mention of personal quarters anywhere in the project brief. He pressed his finger against the location on the blueprint, tracing its outline. It was deep within the house, past rooms that didn't match the current layout. A sound drifted through the corridor. Footsteps. Langley stiffened. The steps were slow and calculated, not heavy enough to be Elliot returning, but too distinct to be settling wood. He turned his head slowly, scanning the dim corridor behind him. Nothing, just the flickering glow of the unlit gas lamps lining the walls. Then, another sound. Paper shifting. Langley spun back toward the desk. The blueprints had moved. The pages were flipping on their own. He watched, transfixed as they stopped on a new page. A sketch of the very corridor he stood in. The paper twitched, the lines shifting ever so slightly as though the ink was still drying and being drawn. His gaze followed the page's details. His own silhouette had been sketched in at the desk, and behind him, standing just within the shadowed hallway, was the faint outline of a second figure. Langley's stomach twisted. Slowly he turned his head. Nothing. He was alone. His phone buzzed again, and he looked down. Another email. From S.C. Blackwood. Subject, do not look back. Langley's instincts screamed at him to turn around anyway, to confirm that no one was there. But something about the message clawed at the edges of his rationality, pressing against his sense of reason. He forced himself to stare at the blueprint, gripping the edges of the desk so tightly his knuckles went white. The room felt colder now, the silence thicker. Then, the lamps along the corridor flickered out one by one. Langley's control cracked. He grabbed the blueprints, shoved them into his bag, and turned, breaking the rule. For a fraction of a second, he saw something at the edge of the dark. Not a full figure, not a person, but a distortion, a suggestion of something standing just beyond his field of vision. Then, the darkness swallowed it whole. Langley ran. He sprinted down the hall, the wooden floor groaning beneath his steps. The corridor twisted, bending in impossible angles, staircases appearing where none should be. Eventually, he came to a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. He grabbed the handle and twisted it. It was locked. Behind him, the hallway had stretched into an unnatural darkness, swallowing the desk, the blueprints, the light. The sound of footsteps followed. Langley's fingers fumbled for anything, a latch, a keyhole, a hidden release. The steps grew closer. Then, without warning, the door unlocked. He didn't think. He threw himself through. The door slammed shut behind him. Langley stumbled forward, gasping for breath. His hands braced against something smooth, polished, wood. He turned, blinking against the dim light. He was standing in an office. It was untouched. Ornate bookshelves lined the walls, their leather-bound tomes perfectly arranged. An old-fashioned desk sat in the center, cluttered with architectural sketches and drafting tools. A half-finished blueprint lay spread across its surface, the ink still drying. Langley's throat tightened. He had seen this room before, not in person, but on the blueprints. These were the architect's quarters. Langley scanned the shelves, the sketches, and the details that made too much sense. All of it was his work, but it was impossibly dated over a century ago. Then his eyes landed on a worn leather journal resting beside the blueprints. He picked it up carefully, flipping it open to the first page. Theodore Langley, architect, Blackwood House, year 1893. Langley's hands trembled. His gaze darted to the last page, the final entry. The handwriting was unmistakably his. The house does not need a builder. It needs a blueprint. It does not want an architect. It wants a creator. It does not wish to be designed. It wishes to be completed. Langley's eyes flicked up to the reflection in the polished surface of the desk. His reflection did not move. Part 4. Langley's gaze locked onto the reflection in the desk's polished surface. The figure mimicked his stance, but not his expression. His own face stared back at him, but the eyes were wrong, darker, sunken, filled with an awareness that wasn't his own. His fingers tightened around the journal, the aged leather warming under his touch. This isn't real. His mind was playing tricks on him, warping his exhaustion and his stress into something irrational. The reflection's head tilted, not a fraction of a second before he moved, a fraction of a second too late. Langley turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing behind him, but the office was empty. Only him, the desk, the bookshelves, the scattered blueprints. When he turned back, the reflection was gone. A sharp knock sounded from the far wall. Langley froze. It wasn't a door, just a wood-paneled section of the room, blending seamlessly with the rest of the architecture. But the knocking came again, even, measured, expectant. He steeled himself and crossed the room, fingers grazing the smooth surface. There was no visible handle, no way to open it, and yet he knew it was a door. His hand pressed forward, expecting resistance. Instead, it swung inward. Beyond the hidden door stretched a narrow hallway lined with gas lamps that burned without flickering. The scent of old parchment and wood polish thickened the air. Langley hesitated at the threshold, instincts screaming at him to turn back, to run. His phone buzzed. From SC Blackwood. Subject, you cannot leave. Langley exhaled sharply, gripping the journal tighter. This wasn't just a building. It wasn't a prank or some elaborate psychological trick. The house was aware, and it was expecting him. He stepped through. The hallway twisted in unnatural ways, subtly shifting as he moved. The further he walked, the longer it stretched, corridors bending at impossible angles. Langley checked the journal as he walked, flipping through its pages. Each entry was written in his own hand. Some of the notes were detailed architectural calculations, adjustments to the foundation, the support beams, and hidden chambers. Others were frantic scribbles, the ink darker, the strokes erratic. The house does not follow our laws. It bends for no one but itself. It does not require preservation. It is preserving me. Langley's hands trembled. The writing changed near the end. The script degraded into mad scrawls, overlapping itself, looping into indecipherable symbols. But one phrase stood out, repeating over and over, filling the final 3 pages. Do not finish the design. A gust of cold rushed down the corridor. Langley looked up. The hall had narrowed, the ceiling lowering, the walls closing in as the gas lamps dimmed. He picked up his pace and then broke into a run. The corridor stretched infinitely. No matter how fast he moved, the exit remained the same distance ahead. The sound of footsteps joined his own. Langley didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The air behind him felt heavier, a presence not his own pressing against his back. The footfalls were close. Too close. His phone buzzed again. From SC Blackwood. Subject, stop running. Langley kept running. The corridor finally split into a staircase, leading downward into darkness. The walls had narrowed to suffocating proportions, forcing him to take the stairs. The steps did not match the blueprints. He would have remembered a spiral staircase descending this deep. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. The gas lamps here were fewer and weaker, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move too fluidly. Langley's fingers brushed the wall for balance and touched something warm. He gasped. The surface of the wall was not wood, not plaster. It was flesh. Langley jerked away, a strangled sound rising in his throat. The wall pulsed. He stumbled back, nearly missing the next step, catching himself on the iron railing. And then the wall exhaled. Langley bolted down the rest of the stairs, not caring where they led, just needing to escape whatever was above him. The space widened suddenly, opening into a vast subterranean chamber. Rows of identical desks lined the space, each stacked with blueprints, drafting tools, and architectural notes. The low glow of desk lamps illuminated the pages, ink drying as if it had just been written. Langley's stomach twisted. He stepped forward, looking at the nearest blueprint. His name was on every single one. His head snapped up as a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was him. A version of himself, older and hollow-cheeked, with sunken eyes that held too much knowledge. The reflection from the desk. Langley staggered back. Who? You should have left, the other him said. The voice was dry, distant. But you didn't. "What is this place?" Langley asked. The other him didn't answer. Instead, he raised a shaking hand and pointed to a single desk at the far end of the chamber. Langley turned his head slowly. On that desk lay a final set of blueprints, a design he had never drawn before, yet somehow recognized. A final room to be completed. His eyes scanned the notes. The last notation at the bottom made his chest tighten. Final architect, Theodore Langley. Status, design incomplete. The older version of himself stepped forward. "It won't let you go," he murmured. "Not until you finish the work." Langley took another step back. "No." The blueprints on every desk shuddered. The entire chamber seemed to shift and breathe. Langley turned to run, but the iron door swung open behind him. The only way out was forward. Part 5. Langley's body remained frozen at the threshold of the chamber. The iron door behind him yawned open, its darkness stretching into nothingness, but he didn't turn toward it. He knew without needing to check that if he did, the hallway that had led him here would be gone. The older version of himself watched from across the room, standing rigid beside the final desk, the set of unfinished blueprints waiting beside him. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow, shadowed by exhaustion so deep it looked carved into his very bones. Langley forced himself to speak. His voice came out raw. "I'm not finishing it." The older Langley exhaled slowly, as if he'd already expected that answer. "You will." Langley clenched his jaw, shaking his head, stepping backward, but the floor beneath him stretched, growing longer, widening the space between him and the iron exit. The chamber was closing in. He snapped his attention back to the desk. The blueprint was spread out, the ink sharp, the lines impossibly precise. He didn't want to move closer, but his feet carried him forward anyway. The older Langley watched him carefully, his posture stiff. "Do you understand it yet?" Langley tore his gaze away from the blueprint. "What?" "The design." His older self gestured toward the plans, his fingers trembling slightly, as if touching them pained him. "Look at it." Langley didn't want to, but something in the way the room pulsed made his head turn downward, eyes falling onto the lines, the measurements, the precise calculations. He expected something grotesque, a void, an impossible construct, a trap. But what he saw instead was simple. It was a room. A perfect room, symmetrical and balanced. Proportions exact, following impossible geometries that made perfect sense only as long as he was looking at them. Langley's throat was dry. "This isn't part of the house." The older Langley exhaled through his nose. "It will be." Langley swallowed, his mind reeling. "It doesn't lead anywhere." "No," his older self said. "That's the point." The shadows shifted. The chamber seemed to breathe again. Langley pressed a palm against the desk, steadying himself, and then flinched as his fingers brushed something cold. A pencil, lying beside the blueprints, waiting. His chest tightened. He looked at his older self, who watched him in silence. Langley shook his head. "I'm not doing this." His older self said nothing. Langley took a step back and then another. The iron door was still open. He turned toward it, toward escape. The moment he moved, the room reacted. The blueprint pages fluttered violently as though caught in a windstorm. The walls shuddered. The ceiling groaned, lowering ever so slightly. The very fabric of the house shifting around him, the ink on the blueprint bled outward, stretching beyond its borders. Understanding, visceral, undeniable, cut through Langley's mind. The house wasn't trying to trap him. It was trying to complete itself. Langley turned sharply to the older version of himself. "This is what it's been waiting for?" His voice cracked. "This is why it won't let me leave?" His older self held his gaze, face unreadable. "You're the final architect." Langley's stomach twisted. The walls lurched inward again, closer this time. The chamber warped, the exit shrinking, the space narrowing toward the single desk, toward the single blueprint. He forced his feet to stay in place. "I don't finish it? Then what?" The older Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you stay." Langley went pale. A deep creaking groan resonated through the chamber, vibrating up through his bones. The very structure of the house was contracting, demanding completion. Langley turned his gaze back to the blueprint. It was a simple room, a perfectly symmetrical room. And yet, his fingertips hovered over the pencil. The older Langley stepped closer, voice almost gentle. "You don't have to fight anymore. Just finish the design." Langley clenched his jaw. His hands were shaking. The iron door groaned, its frame buckling. The house was closing the space, forcing his choice. Langley's vision blurred. His fingers closed around the pencil. The house shuddered in satisfaction. Part 6. Langley's fingers curled around the pencil, his grip tight enough to blanch his knuckles. The house sighed around him, a low, resonant groan like wood settling, or something vast and ancient exhaling in relief. The older version of himself stepped back slightly. "You feel it, don't you?" His voice was quiet, but there was no victory in it, no satisfaction, just exhaustion. Langley swallowed against the tightness in his throat, his eyes locked onto the unfinished design before him. His measurements, his handwriting, but he had never drawn this. Had he? The lines curved in ways that weren't possible, yet were undeniably correct. It was wrong, but it was exact. His mind screamed at him to stop, to resist and fight. His rationality clawed for purchase, demanding he throw the pencil away, but his fingers wouldn't release it. The house was inside him now, pressing against his ribs. Langley understood now. It wasn't about the house. The house was only the vessel. The design was the real thing, the thing that mattered, the thing that had always mattered. "Finish it," his older self whispered. Langley closed his eyes, and then he moved. The moment the pencil touched the blueprint, the house lurched, not physically. No walls caved, no floorboards buckled, but something deep inside it shifted. A wound closing, a puzzle piece snapping into place. The blueprint completed itself beneath his hand. He wasn't even guiding it anymore. The pencil glided, fluid and effortless, tracing lines he didn't fully understand but recognized as correct. The final measurement slid into place. He lifted the pencil. The room went still. For a moment, Langley's breath was the only sound. The older version of himself stood rigid, watching intently, his face unreadable. The house, the presence of it, had stopped pressing forward. There was no more groaning, no more shifting. The chamber was silent. Langley swallowed. Now what? His older self exhaled softly, and something flickered behind his expression. Not relief, not joy, regret. "The cycle ends," he murmured. "For me." Langley's stomach twisted. His older self stepped backward, moving away from the desk, his form already fading at the edges. The shadows consumed him in slow increments, piece by piece, as though unraveling. His voice reached Langley one last time. "Now, it's yours." And then he was gone. For a long moment, Langley didn't move. There was no more pressure in the walls, no more shifting in the air, and yet the house felt not empty, satisfied. His phone buzzed. Langley's fingers shook as he pulled it from his pocket. The screen flickered and then steadied. For the first time since he'd stepped into Blackwood House, he saw signal bars. A missed call. Rachel. His stomach lurched. He swallowed hard, clicked on her contact, and pressed the call button. The dial tone rang once, twice. Then she answered. "Theo." Her voice was tight, breathless. "Theo, oh my God, where have you been? I've been calling for hours." Langley blinked. His throat felt raw, dry. I'm here. He stopped. The iron door behind him was still open. He turned his head toward it. He could see the hallway beyond it now, stretching outward, the walls no longer shifting or bending. It was just a hallway, a way out. "Theo, talk to me," Rachel pressed. His mouth felt heavy. He couldn't speak. The air in his lungs didn't quite fit anymore. His hands trembled. He pressed them flat against the desk to steady himself. The blueprints were gone. Not just the final one, all of them. The desks were bare. The pages had vanished completely as though they'd never existed. A chill ran through him. He forced himself to take a step back, then another. The door remained open. He could walk through it. But something inside him already knew. The cycle hadn't ended. Not really. Only one role had changed. Langley. The voice came from nowhere. Everywhere. A whisper through the wood and the walls. He sucked in a sharp breath, turning toward the sound. No one was there, but he could feel it. Blackwood House had always been waiting, and now it had its architect. Part 7. Langley stood at the threshold of the iron door, the phone still pressed to his ear. Rachel's voice crackled on the line, distant but desperately real. "Theo, are you still there? Say something." His fingers curled against the doorway's frame. The hall beyond stretched ahead, unchanged now, no longer shifting or distorting. He could step forward. He could leave. But his legs felt heavy. His body knew what his mind refused to accept. This wasn't his exit. This wasn't his way home. "Theo?" Rachel's voice had softened, as though she could feel something slipping between them. Langley swallowed hard, his throat thick. "Yeah," he rasped, his voice nearly unrecognizable. "Yeah, I'm here." He took a step forward. The air changed. The house didn't stop him. Another step. He could feel it now. A weight loosening, a grip retreating. His phone buzzed again, a second call coming through. Unknown number. A slow, suffocating dread tightened in his chest. The phone vibrated in his grip, insistent. Reluctantly, he lowered it from his ear and stared at the screen. He already knew who it was. He answered. There was a pause, and then, "You're ready now." Langley's own voice echoed back at him, older, tired, hollow. He whirled around, expecting to see the reflection from before, expecting to face the same worn-out, sunken-eyed version of himself. But the room behind him was empty. Just the desk, the bare wooden floor, and the dim glow of the gas lamps. There was no reflection and no shadow, just his own voice in his ear. "You'll understand soon," the voice continued, calm, almost sympathetic. "You'll forget at first, but it will come back." Langley's throat tightened. His feet were still moving, carrying him through the iron doorway, one step, then another. The air beyond felt thinner and colder, like stepping into a world not fully real. "You don't have to fight anymore," the voice, his voice, said. "You're part of the design now." The line clicked dead. Langley lowered the phone slowly and took the final step through the iron door. Langley staggered in the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. The cool air of the Massachusetts woods wrapped around him, the crisp scent of damp leaves, fresh pine, and distant rain filling his lungs. He turned. Blackwood House stood behind him, silent and still, its windows reflecting nothing. His truck was there, exactly where he had left it, parked at the edge of the overgrown drive. The iron gate stood open, and beyond it, the road stretched back toward everything he had left behind. His fingers curled into fists, and for a long moment, he just stood there. Then, without looking back again, he walked to the truck. Boston felt different. Langley sat in his apartment, the late evening glow bleeding through the windows. The city hummed outside, cars passing, footsteps on pavement. The world hadn't changed, only he had. Rachel sat across from him, fingers curled around a mug of tea. She hadn't stopped looking at him since he'd walked through the door, not in relief or even in anger, but in concern. "You don't look like yourself," she said softly. Langley forced a smile. "Just tired." But he wasn't, not really, because he didn't feel anything at all. Rachel hesitated. "Did you finish the job?" Langley opened his mouth to say no. The words never came. Instead, a memory surfaced. The pencil in his hand, the final stroke of ink, the house settling in satisfaction. His throat closed. "Yeah," he murmured. "I finished it." Rachel studied him for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. "Good," she whispered. "Now you can put it behind you." Langley squeezed her fingers, but deep inside, he knew the truth. It wasn't behind him. It was everywhere. Langley dreamt of the house that night, not in pieces, not in fragments of memory. He saw all of it. The hallways that bent inward, the staircases that led nowhere, the rooms that should not exist but did. The structure no longer fought against itself. It was whole now, complete. He stood in the grand foyer, staring up at the balcony where he had first entered, tracing the impossible angles with his gaze. His reflection watched him from the darkened window, faint, just a suggestion of his own form in the glass. Not waiting, not haunting, belonging. Langley woke with a sharp breath, his chest rising too quickly. The room was dark, but not silent. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He hesitated and then reached for it. A new email sat at the top of his inbox. From S.C. Blackwood. Subject: New architect acquired. Status: restoration complete. Langley didn't move. A second email came through. Project approved. Blueprint attached. His stomach hollowed out. His fingers hovered over the screen, hesitation turning his limbs to stone. Then, slowly, he clicked it open. The blueprint unfolded before him, precise, sharp, and perfect. Not for Blackwood House, but for another. A new project, a new design. His name sat at the top. Theodore Langley, final architect. The world outside the apartment stretched onward, unchanged. The streetlights glowed. The cars passed. Life continued. But somewhere, in some far-off place, the next house was already waiting. Langley exhaled softly, and then, without thinking, he reached for a pencil.
Chilling tales for dark nights.